3 standard weeks had passed since Alara's remarkable demonstration. The diplomatic quarters that had once seemed temporary to Julian now contained subtle traces of permanence, Terran botanical specimens sharing space with Cepheid crystalline sculptures, a fusion of worlds mirroring the unprecedented collaboration unfolding within the colony. Julian reviewed the latest neural mapping data on his workstation as Alara practiced with an advanced version of the communication device. Her progress had been extraordinary, her natural aptitude for languages allowing her to refine the system beyond Julian's original design. Your pronunciation of Andromedan click consonants has improved significantly, Julian noted as the session concluded. You're adapting the interface faster than I can document the changes. Alara's fingers moved in her distinctive patterns, the translator converting her thoughts. The device feels like an extension of myself now. Less translation, more direct expression. Her synthetic voice had taken on subtle inflections that made it increasingly natural. But Father's counsel grows more concerned with each breakthrough. Julian couldn't disagree. The political climate had shifted palpably since Alara's abilities had become public knowledge. What had begun as a personal triumph had evolved into a potential diplomatic flashpoint. A soft chime announced Novia's arrival. She entered with the fluid grace Julian had come to admire, but her scales betrayed concern through muted patterns of gray and amber. Admiral Vex has called an emergency session of the High Council, she announced without preamble. He's demanding oversight of Alara's training and communication protocols. Julian's jaw tightened. On what grounds? Security concerns. Novia's scales darkened. He claims that Alara's abilities represent a potential intelligence breach. That an unchecked talent for decoding secure communications could compromise Cepheid military interests. That's absurd, Julian said, rising from his workstation. Alara's gift is about understanding, not espionage. Politics rarely concerns itself with truth, Novia replied, moving closer to Julian than protocol would normally permit. The Admiral has never approved of the Baron's cooperation with Earth colonies. This gives him leverage. Over the past weeks, Julian and Novia's professional collaboration had deepened into something neither had anticipated. The hours spent together developing Alara's communication systems had led to personal conversations, cultural exchanges, and eventually, tentative explorations of what an attachment between their species might mean. Such relationships were not unprecedented in the colonies, but remained rare and often controversial. Alara's fingers moved rapidly. Admiral Vex visited Father yesterday. They argued about me. About Professor Harlow. About interspecies cooperation. Julian exchanged a concerned look with Novia. What did your father say? He defended me, Alara replied, surprise still evident in her posture. He said my abilities could bridge understanding between our worlds in ways traditional diplomacy cannot. But the Admiral spoke of contamination, cultural, biological, political. A priority message flashed on Julian's console. The Baron's insignia pulsed urgently. Professor Harlow, the Baron's voice emerged before his holographic form fully materialized. You will bring Alara to the central chamber immediately. The Galactic Council representative has arrived ahead of schedule. His scales displayed complex patterns Julian couldn't fully interpret. Be prepared for resistance. Admiral Vex has gathered significant support. The transmission ended abruptly. This isn't just about Alara anymore, Julian said quietly. This is about the future of human-Cepheid relations. Novia moved to prepare Alara for the council appearance, her lower hand briefly intertwining with Julian's, a gesture that would scandalize traditional Cepheids. Whatever happens in that chamber, she said, her translator barely capturing the emotional harmonics in her natural voice, know that you've changed us. Changed me. Julian felt the weight of unspoken words between them. Novia, if things become difficult politically. Don't, she interrupted. We face what comes together. The central chamber rose like a massive geode, its crystalline walls shifting colors with the emotional tenor of its occupants. Today, the dominant hues were cold blues and warning ambers as Julian, Novia, and Alara entered. The Baron stood at the center platform, his posture rigid with formal dignity. Arranged in tiered seating were 24 Cepheid nobles, the Galactic Council representative, and various diplomatic observers, including, Julian noted with relief, Ambassador Thela from Earth. Admiral Vex occupied the opposition platform, his 4 arms bearing ceremonial weapons that glinted menacingly under the chamber's illumination. So the human arrives with his experiment, the Admiral's translator rendered his clicking speech into coldly precise standard. And his Cepheid companion. The inflection made the word sound like an accusation. The Baron silenced him with a gesture. The Council recognizes Professor Julian Harlow of Earth, developmental xenolinguist and advisor to Lady Alara Valkyrian of the Cepheid High Houses. The Galactic Counselor, who Julian now knew was named Cerelian, rose from her position. The Council has reviewed the preliminary reports on Lady Alara's communicative abilities. We find them not merely impressive but potentially transformative for interspecies relations. Admiral Vex stepped forward. Transformative indeed. A Cepheid noble using human technology to intercept secure diplomatic channels? A human with unprecedented access to Cepheid neural patterns? The security implications alone are greatly exaggerated, the Baron interrupted. My daughter's abilities are being guided responsibly by a human and a caretaker with whom he shares inappropriate relations. Vex's accusation echoed through the chamber, causing a ripple of color changes among the assembled Cepheids. I have documented evidence of prohibited physical contact, cultural contamination, and boundary violations. Their collaboration goes far beyond professional parameters. Julian felt Novia stiffen beside him but maintained his composure. My relationship with Lady Alara's guardian, while not the subject of this council, has been conducted with full transparency and respect for both our cultural traditions. Precisely the issue. Vex clicked his mandibles aggressively. Humans speak of integration while undermining our traditions. They claim to respect boundaries while crossing them. First communication protocols, then genetic lines. Where does this encroachment end? The chamber erupted in clicks and color flashes of agreement and dissent. Julian noticed several younger Cepheids displaying color supportive of his position, while older nobles aligned visibly with the Admiral. Alara stepped forward unexpectedly, her communication device active. You speak of tradition, Admiral, her synthesized voice cut through the chaos with surprising authority. But which traditions? Those of war and separation that emerged after contact with other species? Or the older Cepheid traditions of knowledge-seeking and adaptation that built our first stellar colonies? The chamber fell silent. Before my voice was heard, Alara continued, I listened. For 17 cycles, I absorbed the histories, the diplomatic archives, the cultural narratives that few bother to review. Our people were explorers and connectors before they became conquerors. The Admiral's scales flushed with anger. The child presumes to lecture us on our own history? This human influence has clearly. The child, interrupted the Baron with unexpected force, speaks with more wisdom than many of my council. Admiral, your concerns about security protocols are noted, but your accusations regarding personal relationships are irrelevant to these proceedings. Counselor Cerelian nodded in agreement. The Galactic Council's interest lies in communication breakthroughs, not in regulating cultural integration between consenting sentients from aligned worlds. Julian stepped forward. If I may address the security concerns directly? At the Baron's nod, he continued. Lady Alara's abilities could indeed decode sensitive communications, as could many existing AI systems. The difference lies in intention and application. We've developed ethical protocols specifically addressing these concerns. He activated a holographic display showing a complex matrix of safeguards and limitations integrated into Alara's communication system. Furthermore, Julian continued, we propose establishing a joint human Cepheid linguistic institute where these abilities can be studied transparently, with oversight from both worlds and the Galactic Council. Ambassador Thela rose from her observer position. Earth Colonial Authority would support such an institute and provide resources for its implementation. The proposal sent a new wave of discussion through the chamber. Julian noticed the Admiral conferring urgently with his supporters, their scales displaying patterns of calculation and strategic reassessment. As the debate intensified, Novia leaned close to Julian. They're considering it, she whispered. But Vex won't surrender so easily. He has too much invested in maintaining separation between our peoples. Julian nodded, watching the political currents flow through the chamber. The younger Cepheids were increasingly vocal in support of cooperation, while the traditional faction appeared divided. The Baron, surprisingly, seemed to be gaining confidence as the discussion progressed. When Admiral Vex spoke again, his tone had shifted to calculated reasonableness. Perhaps a compromise could be reached. The Institute could proceed under majority Cepheid leadership, with humans serving in advisory roles only. And, his upper eyes fixed pointedly on Julian and Novia, with appropriate cultural boundaries enforced. Julian felt Novia's hand brush against his, a silent communication as clear as any words. Cultural exchange cannot thrive under artificial constraints, Julian responded. The Institute must represent true collaboration, not another form of separation. The Baron's scales shifted to decision-making patterns. I propose the following, a joint institute under shared leadership, with Lady Alara as principal researcher. Security protocols to be established by a committee with equal representation. And, he added with deliberate emphasis, no restrictions on personal or cultural integration between our peoples, provided all parties observe general ethical standards. The chamber erupted once more, but Julian could see the momentum had shifted. The Admiral's support was fragmenting as younger nobles aligned with the Baron's position. Councillor Cerelian's bioluminescence brightened with approval. The Galactic Council finds this proposal aligned with our Charter of Peaceful Integration. We would provide neutral oversight for the initial establishment phase. As the formal vote was called, Julian felt Novia's scales brush against his hand in the Cepheid equivalent of an intimate embrace. Though challenges clearly remained, in this moment, barriers between their worlds were crumbling, not through force or decree, but through understanding and connection. And at the center of it all stood Alara, once thought voiceless, now speaking not just for herself but for a possible future where differences became strengths rather than divisions. The vote concluded with the Baron's proposal passing by a narrow margin. Admiral Vex and his faction departed with barely concealed hostility, their scales broadcasting promises of continued resistance. This isn't over, Novia murmured as they watched them leave. No, Julian agreed. But it's a beginning. Alara's communication device activated with a message directed only to them, and beginnings, I've learned, are the most powerful words of all. The Interspecies Linguistic Institute gleamed under the 3 moons of Proxima Centauri 4, its architecture a deliberate fusion of human and Cepheid design principles. 6 months had transformed what began as a controversial experiment into the colony's crowning achievement, a testament to cooperation that skeptics had claimed impossible. Julian stood on the observation deck, watching shuttles arrive for the Institute's formal inauguration. Delegates from 17 worlds would witness what many now called the Alara Protocols, revolutionary communication systems inspired by the once silent daughter of Baron Drezix. Contemplating your unexpected legacy, Professor? The Baron's voice carried none of its former imperious tone as he joined Julian at the viewport. Their relationship had evolved from suspicion to cautious respect, though Julian suspected the Baron would never fully embrace the changes catalyzed by a simple human linguist. Not mine, Julian corrected. Hers. And yours, for having the courage to reconsider long-held positions. The Baron's scales shifted in a pattern Julian now recognized as rueful acknowledgement. Courage? Perhaps. Necessity, certainly. Admiral Vex's faction continues to lose influence as our youth increasingly favor integration. He turned his 4 eyes toward Julian. They see relationships like yours with Novia not as contamination but as evolution. The mention of Novia brought an involuntary smile to Julian's face. Their partnership had deepened despite persistent opposition from traditionalists. The neurolinguistic research they conducted together had provided convenient professional cover for a personal connection that defied conventional boundaries, biological, cultural, and political. The Admiral arrives today, the Baron continued, his scales displaying concern. His formal opposition has subsided, but my sources report continued clandestine activities. Exercise caution. Julian nodded, appreciating the warning. And Elara? Is she prepared for today's demonstration? More than prepared. Pride colored the Baron's voice, an emotion he no longer attempted to hide regarding his daughter. She awaits you in the primary lab. I believe she has a surprise. The laboratory that had once been a makeshift arrangement in Julian's diplomatic quarters now occupied an entire wing of the institute. Holographic interfaces displayed real-time translations across 12 different species communication systems. At the center stood Elara, her scales shimmering with excitement as Julian entered. Professor, her device translated, though the word carried the Cepheid inflection for respected teacher rather than mere title. We've completed the final calibrations. Novia looked up from an advanced neural scanner, her scales displaying the subtle pattern that Julian had come to recognize as her expression of love, a private communication between them that required no translation. She's been working through the night, Novia said, moving to Julian's side with the easy familiarity of established partners. The enhancements to the translation matrix exceed all projections. Elara's fingers moved rapidly, her excitement barely contained. It's ready. The full-spectrum neural interface, not just for me, but adaptable to any species. Julian examined the sleek device Elara indicated, far smaller than her original translator, yet exponentially more sophisticated. You've miniaturized the entire system? And expanded its capabilities, Novia added. It doesn't merely translate thoughts to speech, it translates experiential reality across species boundaries. Julian's eyebrows rose. Empathic translation? That's theoretical territory we didn't expect to approach for years. Theory becomes practice, came a new voice from the doorway. Counselor Cerellian entered, her silver skin reflecting the laboratory's lights. When sufficient talent is properly nurtured. The Galactic Council representative had become one of the Institute's strongest advocates, recognizing its potential to resolve long-standing conflicts rooted in communicative misunderstanding. Counselor, Julian bowed slightly. We weren't expecting you until the ceremony. Some developments warrant early attention. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted to formal mode. The Council has reviewed your latest proposals. The Elara protocols have been approved for implementation across member worlds. The news struck Julian with unexpected force. What had begun as an attempt to help one silent child had evolved into a system that could reshape interstellar relations. The implications were staggering. Elara approached, her posture displaying confidence that would have been unimaginable months ago. There's more, her device translated. Show him, Novia. Novia activated a holographic display showing neural comparison scans, one unmistakably Cepheid, the other human. We've been studying compatible neural pathways between our species. Not just for communication, but for deeper understanding. The implications were clear even before she continued. Preliminary data suggests the possibility of direct neural synchronization, a bridge beyond words. Shared experience, not merely translated concepts. Julian studied the scans, professional fascination momentarily overshadowing personal implications. This goes beyond linguistics into consciousness sharing? Limited, controlled, and entirely voluntary, Novia clarified, her scales displaying both scientific precision and personal vulnerability. But yes. A true meeting of minds. The air between them charged with unspoken meaning. Such technology would transform interspecies relationships, including their own, in ways previously relegated to theoretical xenopsychology. Their moment of contemplation was interrupted as the laboratory doors slid open again. Admiral Vex entered, flanked by 2 junior officers. His scales displayed rigid formal patterns, betraying nothing of his true thoughts. The human linguist, the Baron's prodigy, and their research team, he said, the translator rendering his clicks with cold precision. How convenient to find you all together before the ceremony. Julian straightened, instantly alert to potential danger. Admiral. We weren't informed you'd be touring the facilities. A last-minute decision. Vex moved to examine the displays, his officers remaining suspiciously close to the doorway. So this is the device that will supposedly revolutionize galactic communication? Rather unimpressive physically. Ilara's fingers moved in subtle patterns that Julian recognized as caution signals. She had detected something in the Admiral's communication frequencies that others couldn't perceive. The Admiral is broadcasting encrypted sub-frequencies, her device whispered to Julian through a private channel they developed. Military-grade communications to someone outside this room. Julian casually positioned himself between the Admiral and the prototype device. The physical interface is minimal by design. The complexity lies in its neural mapping capabilities. Indeed. Vex's mandibles clicked with barely concealed disdain. Neural mapping that conveniently places Cepheid thought patterns into accessible formats for any species to exploit. Counselor Cerelian's bioluminescence flashed with diplomatic warning. The Council has reviewed security protocols extensively, Admiral. Your concerns have been addressed in the implementation guidelines. Guidelines. The Admiral's scales rippled with derision. While humans and their sympathizers dismantle centuries of biological and cultural separation. He turned pointedly toward Novia and Julian. Integration leads to dissolution. Of culture. Of identity. Of species integrity. The laboratory's atmosphere tensed as the Admiral's true agenda emerged. This wasn't a courtesy visit, it was a final assessment before some planned action. Ilara moved forward unexpectedly, positioning herself directly before the Admiral. Her fingers worked rapidly as her device translated. Your concern isn't for our culture, Admiral. It's for your authority in a changing world. The Admiral's scales darkened dangerously. You presume much, child. I perceive much, she corrected. Including the military frequencies you're currently broadcasting. Would you like me to translate them for the Counselor? A momentary flicker of alarm crossed the Admiral's scales before he mastered himself. Baseless accusations. The child's device clearly malfunctions. Julian watched the subtle interplay, realizing that Ilara had maneuvered the Admiral into a corner. If she could indeed decode his secure communications, his conspiracy stood exposed. If he denied it too forcefully, he would implicitly confirm her abilities, the very capabilities he claimed presented security risks. Novia stepped forward, her scales displaying protective patterns. Admiral, might I suggest we continue this discussion after the inauguration ceremony? The delegates will be assembling shortly. The tension held for several heartbeats before the Admiral's scales settled into calculated retreat. Of course. We will revisit these security concerns formally before the Council. His gaze lingered on Julian and Novia. All of these concerns. As the Admiral departed with his officers, Ilara's fingers moved rapidly. He's delaying, not abandoning his opposition. The frequencies contained references to contingency plans. Counselor Cerellian's bioluminescence pulsed with concern. "I will alert Council security. If the Admiral attempts to disrupt today's proceedings, he will find himself facing more than local consequences." Julian exchanged glances with Novia, unspoken understanding passing between them. Whatever challenges awaited, they would face them together, not as human and Cepheid, but as partners in something new and uncharted. The inauguration ceremony transformed the Institute's central atrium into a living symbol of interspecies harmony. Delegates from across the galactic sector gathered beneath a holographic canopy displaying real-time translations of 17 different communication systems: auditory, visual, telepathic, and chemical. Baron Drezix, resplendent in ceremonial armor that now bore symbols of both tradition and innovation, addressed the assembly with unwanted eloquence. Behind him stood Elara, no longer hidden but prominently positioned as the ceremony's central figure. "What began as a personal journey has become a beacon for our collective future," the Baron's translator rendered his speech into standard. "My daughter's silence taught us that we had failed to listen properly. Her voice now teaches us new ways to hear each other across the divisions of biology, culture, and history." From their position among the Earth delegation, Julian and Novia watched with professional pride and personal investment. Their research, their relationship, their very existence together represented the future being celebrated: connection across difference, strength through diversity. The Baron continued, "Today we present not merely a technology but a philosophy. The Elara protocols represent a fundamental shift from translation to true understanding." Julian scanned the audience, noting Admiral Vex and his supporters clustered near a secondary exit. Their scales displayed patterns of restrained hostility, but the presence of Council security appeared to have deterred any immediate action. The ceremony reached its culmination as Elara stepped forward to demonstrate the enhanced communication system. Now 17 cycles old, fully adult by Cepheid standards, she had transformed from the silent, withdrawn child Julian had first encountered. Her scales shimmered with confidence as she addressed the gathered dignitaries. "Words divide as often as they connect," her device translated. "What I offer today goes beyond words to meaning, beyond translation to experience." She activated the new interface, and the atrium filled with a symphony of light, sound, and sensation. Delegates gasped as they experienced, for the first time, the perceptual reality of species unlike their own. Terrans briefly felt the electromagnetic spectrum as Cepheids perceived it. Vegan telepaths momentarily understood the textural language of crystalline Taurians. Scent communicating Conopans experienced the visual poetry of Solarian bioluminescence. For 60 seconds, barriers dissolved. Not through erasure of difference, but through its direct experience. When the demonstration ended, the silence that followed held wonder rather than absence. Julian felt Novia's hand find his, her scales changing to the intimate pattern only he could fully interpret. Around them, delegates from worlds long separated by communicative chasms began conversing with newfound understanding. Even Admiral Vex and his faction appeared momentarily shaken from their opposition, their scales displaying the unmistakable patterns of fundamental reconsideration. The Baron approached Julian and Novia, his formal demeanor softened by genuine emotion. "It appears we have begun something that cannot easily be stopped, Professor Harlow. The best revolutions are the ones that make us more fully ourselves, not less," Julian replied. "Elara hasn't erased the boundaries between us, she's made them places of meeting rather than division." Elara joined them, her fingers moving in the patterns that had once been her only voice and now complemented her many modes of expression. "The Admiral's opposition will continue," her device translated privately. "But he now stands against the current of history." Novia's scales rippled with gentle amusement. "And how does history appear from your unique perspective, Elara?" "Unwritten," she replied. "But with promising first words." As the ceremonial reception began, Julian found himself at the periphery with Novia, watching the mingling of species with a sense of accomplishment that transcended professional pride. "The Baron has approved my petition," Novia said quietly, her scales displaying nervous anticipation. "The genetic compatibility research can proceed if you still wish it." Julian took both her hands in his, human fingers intertwining with Cepheid digits in a gesture that would have scandalized traditionalists months ago but now drew only passing interest. "Some boundaries require more than translation to cross," he said. "But if there's one thing we've learned, it's that differences can harmonize rather than divide." She completed his thought, their connection requiring no technological interface. Across the atrium, Elara stood at the center of admiring delegates, her once silent presence now the catalyst for a symphony of worlds learning, at last, to truly hear each other. The path forward would hold challenges: Admiral Vex's faction, biological complexities, cultural resistance, but the foundations had been laid for connections once thought impossible. Julian looked at Novia, at Elara, at the gathering of worlds, and understood that this was just the beginning of a conversation across stars, one that had started with a father's dismissal, a daughter's silence, and a human's willingness to listen when no one else would. In the space between worlds, voices once unheard now shaped the future, proof that the most profound revolutions began not with declarations of power, but with moments of understanding. The crystalline towers of New Alexandria colony gleamed under the triple moons of Proxima Centauri 4, a testament to humanity's determination to make a home among alien stars. Professor Julian Harlow adjusted his atmospheric regulator as he entered the Grand Embassy, where tonight's interstellar diplomatic summit would either strengthen or fracture the tenuous alliance between Earth and the Cepheid Confederation. "Professor Harlow, your credentials," requested the blue-skinned Vexillian security officer. "The Baron's delegation has already arrived." Julian presented his diplomatic clearance, his mind focused on the xenolinguistic presentation he'd prepared. 20 years studying alien communication patterns had earned him this opportunity, and he couldn't afford mistakes. The grand hall buzzed with conversations in dozens of languages, some spoken, some telepathic, others expressed through color changes and scent markers. Julian navigated through groups of diplomats until spotting his target, Baron Drezik's Valkyrian, High Commander of the Cepheid Fleet and rumored hardliner against deeper human integration. The Baron stood nearly 8 feet tall, his iridescent scales shifting hues beneath ornate ceremonial armor. Forearms gestured dramatically as he addressed fellow alien dignitaries, his translator device converting his native chirps and clicks into standard English. "The human colonies expand too rapidly," Drezix was saying. "Their communication systems remain primitive, their understanding of galactic protocols insufficient." Julian approached slowly, waiting for the proper moment to introduce himself. That's when he noticed her, a small figure partially hidden behind the Baron's imposing form. Unlike the other Cepheids with their constant color shifting and movement, she remained still, her scales a muted violet. She appeared young, perhaps the equivalent of a human teenager, and her eyes held an intelligence that immediately caught Julian's attention. Ambassador Thela, Earth's chief diplomat, made the introduction. "Baron Drezix, may I present Professor Julian Harlow, Earth's foremost expert on interspecies communication." The Baron's upper eyes narrowed while his lower set remained fixed on Julian. "Another human linguist? Your species seems obsessed with talking. Perhaps you should focus more on listening." Julian bowed respectfully. "Often the quietest voices carry the most profound messages, Baron." The Baron made a dismissive gesture with his lower right arm. "Speaking of quiet, Professor, this is my daughter, Elara." He nudged the small figure forward with unnecessary force. "A disappointment among our kind. 17 cycles old and has never formed a proper vocal pattern or color speech." Julian watched as the young alien scales darkened with what he recognized as the Cepheid equivalent of embarrassment. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on his face with undisguised curiosity. "Has she been examined by communication specialists?" Julian asked carefully. The Baron's scales flashed irritation. By the finest healers in 3-star systems. They found nothing physically wrong, just a failure of will or intelligence. His tone turned mocking. Perhaps she takes after her mother's bloodline. Julian noticed how Alara's hands moved subtly at her sides, not random movements, but what appeared to be a pattern. While the Baron continued disparaging his daughter's condition to the assembled diplomats, Julian knelt to Alara's level. "Hello," he said softly, without his translator, instead forming the greeting chirp in native Cepheid himself. The Baron paused mid-sentence. "Don't waste your breath, human." She understands well enough, but refuses or is unable to respond properly. But Julian noticed something the Baron clearly hadn't, a distinct pattern in the gentle movements of Alara's fingers, reminiscent of the hand-signing systems used by certain nonverbal humans. Not random fidgeting, but deliberate communication. "Baron Drezix," Julian said, standing, "with your permission, I'd like to speak with Alara during my stay." The Baron's scales rippled with amusement. "If you wish to waste your time, Professor, be my guest. Perhaps human linguistic experts can succeed where Cepheid neurobiologists have failed, though I doubt it." He turned away dismissively. "Novia will bring her to your quarters tomorrow." As the Baron moved to engage with more important dignitaries, Julian watched Alara's fingers continue their subtle dance. In that moment, he was certain, the Baron's daughter wasn't silent because she had nothing to say. She was silent because no one had learned how to listen. The morning light of Proxima Centauri filtered through the programmable windows of Julian's temporary quarters, casting prismatic patterns across the room. He had spent half the night researching Cepheid neurophysiology and preparing his workspace with various communication tools, both digital and physical, unsure exactly what might prove useful with Alara. A melodic chime announced visitors. The door slid open to reveal Alara, accompanied by a tall, willowy Cepheid female whose scales shimmered with subtle green and gold patterns, markings Julian recognized as indicators of the caretaker caste. "Professor Harlow," she said, her translator rendering her speech in a musical contralto. "I am Novia, guardian to Lady Alara. Baron Drezix instructed me to bring her for your experiment." Her tone carried skepticism, but her posture suggested something else, hope, perhaps. Julian bowed in the traditional Cepheid manner. "Thank you for coming. Please, enter." Alara glided into the room, her eyes immediately darting to the various instruments and screens Julian had arranged. Her fingers twitched at her sides in that same rhythmic pattern he'd noticed before. "The Baron has granted you 3 Earth weeks to work with Lady Alara," Novia explained, her lower eyes focused on the girl with unmistakable affection. "He expects daily progress reports." "Of course," Julian nodded. "Though I should mention that communication breakthroughs rarely follow convenient timetables." Novia's scales rippled with what Julian interpreted as amusement. "The Baron does not concern himself with inconvenient realities, Professor. It's why he's risen to his position." She moved to leave, but Julian called after her. "Actually, Novia, would you mind staying? Your insights could be invaluable, and Alara might be more comfortable with you present." Surprise flickered across Novia's scales, but she inclined her head. "No one has asked for my input before." Julian gestured to the curved seating arranged in a semicircle. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. This isn't an examination, it's a conversation. Or at least, it will be." For the next 2 hours, Julian worked through various communication protocols, careful never to treat Alara as a subject or specimen. He observed how her attention locked onto certain visual patterns and frequencies, how her fingers continued their subtle movements, and how she seemed to respond to particular harmonic tones. "Novia," Julian asked during a brief respite, "when did you first notice Alara's hand movements?" The caretaker's scales darkened slightly. "You noticed them too?" "They began around her 9th cycle. The Baron's physicians dismissed them as nervous twitching, a sign of her developmental inadequacies. Julian moved to a holographic interface and pulled up recording data. They're not random. Look here, he displayed a slowed-down sequence of Alara's finger patterns from the past hour. There's repetition, structure. It's a language system she's developed independently. Novia leaned forward, her scales brightening with excitement. You believe she's been communicating all along? I'm certain of it, Julian said. And I think I can prove it. He approached Alara with a small device in his palm. This is a neural response visualizer. With your permission, he said directly to Alara, I'd like to see how your brain processes language. Alara's upper eyes blinked once, the Cepheid equivalent of affirmation. The device hummed softly as Julian held it near Alara's cranial ridge. The nearby screen illuminated with cascading patterns of neural activity, displaying a complexity that made Julian catch his breath. Extraordinary, he whispered. Novia, look at this activity in her language centers. It's not underdeveloped, it's hyperdeveloped. Her neural pathways are processing language in ways I've never seen before. Novia moved closer, her scent markers releasing a subtle fragrance of confusion. But if she can process language, why can't she speak? Julian's eyes never left the screen. Because she's processing too much, too quickly. Cepheid communication involves speech, color patterns, scent markers, and subtle electromagnetic signals, all simultaneously. What if Alara receives all these inputs with greater sensitivity than normal? Sensory overload, Novia breathed, understanding dawning in her posture. Exactly. She's not communicating less, she's experiencing more. Julian turned to face Alara directly. You're not broken. You're exceptional. The girl's scales rippled with a depth of color Julian had not seen before, a complex emotion beyond his knowledge of Cepheid expressions. Over the following days, Julian and Novia worked together, developing a modified interface that could translate Alara's finger movements into Cepheid color speech and vocalizations. The process was painstaking, with many failures, but each small success brought visible change to Alara's demeanor. By the end of the second week, Julian found himself working late into the night, Novia often staying to assist. Their conversations had evolved beyond Alara's condition to personal histories, cultural comparisons, and philosophical discussions of interspecies communication. Julian found himself increasingly drawn to Novia's intellect and compassion, qualities rarely celebrated in the rigid hierarchy of Cepheid society. You've given her dignity, Novia said one evening as they watched Alara sleeping peacefully in a resting chamber Julian had modified to reduce sensory input. No one has ever seen her as you do. Julian shook his head. I simply paid attention. The Baron has been so focused on what she can't do that he's missed everything she can. Novia's scales darkened as she moved closer to him, her scent changing subtly. Your approach is unfamiliar to our people. The Baron values strength, assertion, dominance. You lead with curiosity and patience. Different worlds, different values, Julian said, acutely aware of her proximity. Perhaps, Novia said softly, we need more bridges between our worlds. The moment was interrupted by an urgent message notification. The Baron's holographic form materialized in the center of the room. Professor Harlow, he said, mandibles clicking with impatience, the Galactic Council envoy arrives tomorrow. You will demonstrate whatever progress you've made with Alara at the reception. I expect results, not excuses. Before Julian could respond, the transmission ended. Novia's scales paled with anxiety. He's testing you, and her. If she fails to perform as he expects. Julian looked at the sleeping form of Alara, then at the communication interface they'd been developing. It wasn't ready. They needed more time. Then we work through the night, he said, determination hardening his voice. Because tomorrow, Alara is going to speak, and the Baron is going to listen.